In 1989, three innocent little girls vanished without a trace from their own front yard, leaving a community shattered and families broken beyond repair. For 34 long years, their disappearance remained one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries, until someone stumbled upon a strange tape that would finally break the silence. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The grainy footage from the Millbrook Police Department archives shows the chaos that erupted within hours of the disappearance. Officer Thomas Sullivan, then a rookie patrolman, appears in an old interview, his weathered face creased with the memory of that July evening in 1989. "We'd never handled anything like it before," Sullivan explains, his voice still haunted. "Three little girls, just gone." The whole department was in shock. The small-town police force, consisting of just 7 officers, was immediately overwhelmed. Archival footage shows police cruisers with flashing lights illuminating the Peterson Inn yard, transforming the once peaceful family space into a frantic command center. Janet Peterson stands in the background of one clip, her eyes wide with terror, as she clutches a photograph of Emma to her chest. By nightfall, over 100 volunteers had arrived, forming search parties that combed through the woods and ditches surrounding the property. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness as calls for the girls echoed across the neighborhood. The community's response was immediate and overwhelming. Teachers, church members, and local business owners all abandoning their evening plans to join the search. "The rumors started almost immediately," recalls a former dispatcher in her interview. "Someone said they saw a van. Someone else mentioned a stranger at the grocery store earlier that week." In a town like Millbrook, where everyone knew everyone, any outsider became suspicious. As midnight approached, powerful floodlights were set up around the perimeter of the property, casting harsh shadows across the yard where the children had been playing just hours before. The oak tree, once a symbol of carefree summer days, now loomed ominously over the scene. By dawn, exhaustion had settled over the searchers. No footprints leading away from the property. No witnesses who had seen the girls leave. The partially open gate yielded no fingerprints, no fabric tears, nothing to indicate a struggle. The absence of evidence was perhaps the most disturbing element of all. The camera lingers on footage of the empty swing set, gently moving in the morning breeze. Then it cuts to Janet, sitting on the porch steps, her trembling hands clutching a small pink shoe, Emma's favorite, found discarded near the flower bed. Her face is a mask of devastation. "It was like the earth had simply opened up and swallowed those children," Sullivan says, his voice breaking. And the weight of that absence? You could feel it pressing down on everyone. The whole town was suffocating under it. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The investigation quickly hit a wall. Detective Sullivan, then a young officer with only 3 years on the force, led a team of 4 officers systematically canvassing the neighborhood. They knocked on every door within a mile radius of the Peterson home, desperate for any scrap of information about Emma, Lucy, and Mia. "We interviewed everyone twice," Sullivan recalls in present-day footage, his weathered face showing the weight of an unsolved case. Back then, Millbrook was different. No security cameras on porches, no cell phones tracking movements. Just people and their memories. Old friends and neighbors from 1989 appear on screen. Their testimonies tinged with nostalgia for a simpler time. Martha Jenkins, who lived 3 houses down, describes how children would roam freely until sunset. "Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. We watched out for each other's kids. At least we thought we did." Meanwhile, Janet Peterson became a ghost in her own home. Footage shows her wandering the yard at all hours, retracing steps, searching for something, anything, that might explain what happened that scorching July afternoon. Her fingers would brush against the swing set, where Emma had played just hours before vanishing. She'd stand motionless by the oak tree, listening for echoes of laughter that no longer filled the air. "I keep thinking if I'd called them in 5 minutes earlier," Janet whispers in an interview, her voice cracking. "If I'd been watching from the window instead of preparing snacks." The authorities examined the partially open gate meticulously. They dusted for fingerprints, measured the gap, and reconstructed possible scenarios. Officer Thomas Miller, now retired, shakes his head as he recalls the frustration. No forced entry, no broken lock, just slightly ajar, like someone had casually walked through. The absence of physical evidence was maddening. No footprints despite the soft ground near the fence line. No witnesses despite the neighborhood's usual afternoon activity. No suspicious vehicles reported, though the teenage girl's account of seeing a van would later prove crucial. Information dismissed at the time due to her youth and the chaos of the investigation. As days stretched into weeks, the investigation stalled. The community gathered for searches, combing woods and ditches with flashlights and desperate hope. Flyers with the girls' smiling faces appeared on every telephone pole and storefront window. The hardest part, Sullivan admits, wasn't the lack of evidence. It was looking into Janet's eyes every day and having nothing new to tell her. The mystery deepened with each passing day, leaving 3 empty bedrooms in 3 different homes and a community forever changed by what they couldn't see and couldn't know. As July melted into August, the families of Emma Peterson, Lucy, and Mia lived suspended between 2 unbearable realities. Hope, fragile yet persistent, battled against the growing shadow of despair. Candlelight vigils illuminated the Millbrook Town Square each Sunday evening. The flickering lights, a testament to a community's refusal to surrender to darkness. Prayer circles formed spontaneously on street corners and in living rooms, while missing child posters appeared on every telephone pole, storefront, and bulletin board across 3 counties. Janet Peterson moved through these weeks like a ghost in her own life. She refused to leave the house for more than a few hours, terrified that Emma might somehow find her way home to an empty house. "I need to be here when she comes back," she whispered to neighbors, who brought casseroles and concern to her door. Her husband withdrew into himself, seeking refuge in longer work hours at the factory. The growing distance between them, another casualty of their shared tragedy. At night, Janet would sit in Emma's bedroom, running her fingers over stuffed animals and picture books. Sleep, when it came, brought vivid dreams of her daughter calling out for her. Dreams so real that she would wake searching the darkness, her heart racing with momentary hope before reality crashed back. The once tight-knit community began showing fracture lines. Whispered accusations circulated at the grocery store and after church services. "Did you hear about the Petersons' neighbor who always took pictures of the neighborhood children? What about that odd man who delivered packages?" Long-standing friendships dissolved under the weight of suspicion and fear. Lucy's parents stopped attending the vigils after 3 weeks, unable to bear the public performance of grief. Mia's mother threw herself into organizing search parties that ventured farther and farther from town, returning each time with nothing but exhaustion. The local police station became a revolving door of reported sightings and theories. "I saw 3 girls who looked just like them at the mall in Nashville," one well-meaning woman insisted. "My cousin in Kentucky thinks he spotted them at a gas station," offered another. Each lead investigated, each hope raised and then dashed. By September, when school resumed, 3 empty desks in the second-grade classroom stood as silent monuments. Teachers struggled to explain the absence to confused classmates. Parents held their children tighter, implemented strict curfews, and eyed strangers with newfound suspicion. The community that had once prided itself on being a place where everyone knew everyone now regarded itself with uncertainty. Beneath the surface of potlucks and church socials, a current of unease flowed. The unanswered questions hung in the air like the late summer humidity, persistent, uncomfortable, and impossible to escape. As the investigation entered its second week, the Millbrook Police Department shifted their focus outward. Detective Sullivan, then a young officer with only 3 years on the force, led a team examining traffic patterns around the Peterson home. They meticulously interviewed every delivery driver, postal worker, and utility employee who might have passed through the neighborhood that scorching July afternoon. "We were grasping at straws," Sullivan recalls, his weathered face creasing with the memory. "Every day without those girls felt like a personal failure." The most promising lead emerged when 3 different neighbors mentioned seeing an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the intersection where Emma, Lucy, and Mia had been playing. Descriptions varied. Some called it a panel van, others a delivery truck. But the consensus pointed to a dark-colored automobile with no windows on its sides. Janet Peterson spent hours with sketch artists, reviewing potential suspect profiles until her eyes burned with fatigue. Her husband withdrew into silence, taking long drives at night, searching streets and back roads that had already been combed by officials. Their marriage, once solid as oak, began showing hairline fractures under the relentless pressure. "We stopped talking," Janet admits in a rare moment of vulnerability, "not because we didn't love each other, but because every conversation led back to Emma, and neither of us could bear the pain." The community rallied around the families with meals and prayer circles, but as days stretched into weeks, subtle changes emerged. Parents no longer allowed children to play unsupervised. Neighbors eyed strangers with suspicion. The once welcoming town developed an invisible barrier of fear. Perhaps the most devastating missed opportunity came in the form of 15-year-old Melissa Winters. The teenager had been babysitting at a house 2 streets over on that fateful day. Walking home, she spotted 3 little girls talking to someone in what she described as a dark blue van with a dent in the back door. "Nobody took me seriously," Melissa explains, now a middle-aged woman with children of her own. "The officer patted my head and said I was being helpful, but I could tell he thought I was making things up for attention." Her statement was filed away, buried under hundreds of other leads deemed more credible. The description of the vehicle, the specific detail about the dented door, the approximate time, all potentially crucial information that would sit dormant for decades. Meanwhile, Lucy's birthday came and went. Mia's mother collapsed during a press conference. And Janet kept Emma's nightlight burning, refusing to extinguish that small flame of hope even as the investigation's momentum began to falter against the unyielding wall of the unknown. The investigation's focus shifted dramatically as weeks turned into months. Detectives began examining outsiders who might have passed through Millbrook around the time of the disappearances. Every delivery driver, traveling salesman, and drifter who had been anywhere near Tennessee that summer became a person of interest. Janet Peterson spent countless hours at the police station, reviewing photographs of potential suspects until her eyes burned with fatigue. The determined mother refused to give up, even as other parents in the community began the painful process of accepting that their daughters might never return. "There was a suspicious vehicle," insisted one elderly resident during a community meeting. A dark-colored van parked near the Peterson place that week. This triggered a flurry of activity as officers tracked down every similar vehicle within a 100-mile radius, but each lead evaporated upon investigation. Detective Sullivan, then a young officer eager to prove himself, interviewed dozens of locals. "People wanted to help," he later recalled. "Everyone had something to report, but nothing substantial materialized." The frustration within the department grew palpable as pressure mounted from both grieving families and an increasingly impatient public. Perhaps the most haunting revelation came from 13-year-old Melissa Harkins, who lived 3 houses down from the Peterson home. The teenager reported seeing Emma, Lucy, and Mia walking toward the main road that afternoon, apparently following someone. A man was standing beside what she described as a work van, with no windows on its sides. "Nobody believed me," Melissa explained in a tearful interview years later. "They said I was making things up for attention, that I was just a kid with an overactive imagination." Her account, dismissed due to her youth and lack of corroborating evidence, would be filed away and forgotten, until decades later when it would resurface with devastating implications. The community, initially united in search efforts, began fracturing under the weight of suspicion. Parents kept their children indoors. Neighbors eyed one another warily across once friendly fences. The church, once a place of solace, became a weekly reminder of 3 empty spaces in the children's choir. Sullivan's team pursued every angle, interviewing employees at the electronics depot on the edge of town, including its owner Harold Vance, who claimed to have been out of state that week. His alibi checked out, and investigators moved on, unaware that the unassuming businessman harbored dark secrets that would remain hidden for more than 3 decades. As autumn leaves fell across Millbrook, the case that had consumed the small community began its slow, painful descent into the cold case files. For the families of Emma, Lucy, and Mia, the approaching winter brought not just a change in season, but the first of many years of unanswered questions. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. As the 90s gave way to a new millennium, the case of the 3 missing girls slowly receded from the headlines. For the people of Millbrook, Tennessee, however, the wound remained raw and open. The absence of Emma, Lucy, and Mia had become woven into the very fabric of the community, a shared grief that defined an entire generation. Janet Peterson refused to let her daughter become just another statistic. Though the lines on her face deepened with each passing year, her resolve never wavered. She became a familiar sight around town, often seen tending to the memorial beneath the old oak tree where the girls had played their last game of secret agents. The weathered photographs of 3 smiling faces, protected under laminate but faded by sun and rain, stood as silent sentinels of a mother's undying hope. "I still feel her," Janet would tell anyone who would listen, her voice soft but unwavering. "Some days I swear I can hear Emma laughing in the yard." Her marriage had not survived the strain. The empty bedroom down the hall, preserved exactly as it had been that July afternoon in 1989, had become too much for her husband to bear. He had moved to Nashville, starting a new life, while Janet remained anchored to the past, unable and unwilling to move forward without answers. The annual memorial service grew smaller each year. What had once been a community-wide gathering slowly dwindled to a handful of faithful attendees, mostly family members and a few neighbors who couldn't bring themselves to forget. They would gather beneath the oak, light candles, and share memories that grew hazier with time. Former investigators who had worked the case found themselves haunted by their failure. Sullivan, once the department's most promising detective, had retired early, the unsolved disappearance weighing heavily on his conscience. He would occasionally drive past the Peterson home, slowing his vehicle to a crawl, wondering what clue they had missed. For the children of Millbrook, the story of Emma, Lucy, and Mia became a cautionary tale. Parents would whisper warnings about talking to strangers, pointing to the 3 empty swings at the playground as a grim reminder of what could happen. The depot where Harold Vance had once worked stood abandoned at the edge of town, its windows boarded up. Avoided by locals who claimed to feel a chill when passing by. "Lock your doors," mothers would tell their children. "Don't wander too far." The innocence that had once defined this small Tennessee community had been replaced by a persistent wariness, a collective trauma passed down through whispered warnings at dusk. Yet through it all, Janet Peterson kept her vigil, her optimism unwavering, even as her hair turned from brown to silver. "They're out there somewhere," she would say, "and someday we'll know the truth." For over 3 decades, the case of the missing girls remained an open wound in Millbrook's collective memory. Janet Peterson, once a vibrant young mother, had grown into her 60s with a quiet dignity that commanded respect throughout the community. Despite the silver threads now dominating her once auburn hair, her eyes still held the same unwavering hope they had in 1989. Every July 15th, Janet would place 3 fresh bouquets beneath the old oak tree where the children had last played. The ritual became a town tradition, with neighbors joining in silent solidarity. Some brought candles, others teddy bears or small toys, tokens for children forever frozen in time at ages 7 and 8. "I know my Emma is somewhere," she would tell anyone who would listen, her voice steady despite the years of heartache. A mother knows these things. The former investigators had scattered over the decades. Some retired, others moved away, unable to shake the shadow of their greatest unsolved case. Detective Sullivan, now in his 70s with arthritic hands and fading eyesight, still kept a worn case file in his home office. He would review it occasionally, wondering if something had been missed. At Millbrook Elementary, teachers still used the story as a somber reminder about stranger danger, though they softened the details for younger students. The disappearance had transformed from recent tragedy to local legend, whispered about at sleepovers and around campfires. Janet's marriage had not survived the weight of their loss. Her husband moved to Ohio 5 years after Emma vanished, unable to live in a house filled with ghosts. Janet refused to leave, keeping Emma's bedroom exactly as it had been that summer day. Pink walls, stuffed animals arranged on the bed, a half-finished puzzle on the small wooden desk. The Peterson home became something of a shrine, with Janet its faithful keeper. On weekends, she could be seen tending the garden where the girls had played, speaking softly to herself, or perhaps to Emma, as she pruned roses and pulled weeds. Lucy's parents had moved away after 2 years, unable to bear the constant reminders. Mia's family stayed until 1997 before relocating to Florida, though they returned each year for the memorial. The town itself changed around Janet. The small shopping center expanded, new housing developments sprung up on former farmland, and the old highway was widened to 4 lanes. Yet the mystery remained, suspended in time like an insect in amber, preserved, visible, but untouchable. Children who weren't even born when the tragedy occurred grew up in its shadow, taught to be cautious in a way their parents never were before that fateful summer day. The case became Millbrook's defining story, the moment when innocence was lost and doors began to be locked at night. Janet Peterson was the first to receive the call. Her weathered hands trembled as she clutched the phone, listening to Detective Santos explain what construction workers had discovered at the old electronics depot. After 34 years of waiting, hoping, and praying, someone had found a dusty box of cassette tapes labeled with 3 names: Emma, Lucy, Mia, and the date that had forever changed her life: 15/7/1989. "They found what?" she whispered, her voice barely audible as she sank into her kitchen chair. The detective's words seemed to hover in the air around her, too momentous to fully absorb. At 67, Janet had become the quiet backbone of Millbrook. Her silver hair and kind eyes were familiar to everyone in town, her resilience an inspiration to those who knew her story. The grandmother of 3 now spent her days volunteering at the community center, but everyone understood that beneath her gentle smile lay an unhealed wound. When she saw the photograph of the tape labels, Emma's name written in faded blue ink, something inside her both broke and mended simultaneously. Her daughter's name, preserved all these years, was like seeing a ghost materialize before her eyes. "I need to call the other families," she told Santos, her voice finding new strength. Within hours, the news had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The town that had tried to move forward now found itself pulled back into its darkest chapter. The tapes were carefully transported to a forensic laboratory specializing in audio restoration. The families gathered at the community center, a space that had hosted countless prayer vigils in the months after the disappearance. Lucy's parents, now in their 70s, held hands tightly. Mia's mother sat alone, her ex-husband having left Millbrook decades ago, unable to bear the weight of their loss. "What if we hear their voices?" Lucy's father asked, his weathered face etched with both hope and dread. "What if we hear something worse?" The waiting was excruciating. Days stretched into a week as technicians worked to extract sound from the degraded magnetic tape. Janet visited the old oak tree in her yard each morning, touching its rough bark as if communing with the past. The tree that had witnessed the girls' last moments of play now stood as a silent sentinel to her renewed determination. Local media descended upon the small Tennessee town once again. Reporters who hadn't been born when the girls vanished now stood outside the depot, filming segments against the backdrop of the derelict building where the tapes had been hidden for over 3 decades. For the families, every passing hour was agony, a tormenting mix of desperate hope for answers and paralyzing fear of what those answers might reveal. Yet beneath the anxiety lay something that had been absent for too long: the possibility of truth. Detective Maria Santos sat across from retired investigator Thomas Sullivan at the Millbrook Police Station, their faces illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights as they assembled the newly formed task force. The contrast between them was striking. Santos with her modern forensic approach, and Sullivan with his decades of local knowledge and intuition. "These tapes could change everything," Santos said, carefully handling the evidence bags containing the cassettes found at the old electronics depot. Her methodical nature was evident in how she arranged the files chronologically. Sullivan nodded, his weathered face reflecting years of carrying this unsolved case. 34 years I've been waiting for something like this. Never thought it would come from Harold Vance's old place." The forensic team had worked tirelessly to restore the degraded recordings. When they finally played the first tape, labeled Emma, Lucy, Mia, 15/7/1989, the room fell silent. The childish voices that emerged from the speakers sent chills through everyone present. Agent Emma reporting for duty. Came the clear voice of Janet Peterson's daughter, followed by giggles from Lucy and Mia as they played their secret agent game. The innocence in their voices stood in stark contrast to the grim circumstances of their recording. Sullivan closed his eyes, transported back to that scorching July day when 3 little girls vanished without a trace. "They were alive," he whispered, "at least for some time after they disappeared." Santos leaned forward, her attention caught by something else. "Listen to the background," she instructed, increasing the volume. Beyond the children's voices, they could hear the distinct hum of vehicles passing by, and faintly but unmistakably, the sound of heavy trucks. "That's the highway," Sullivan said, suddenly alert. They were kept somewhere near Interstate 75. The task force meticulously analyzed every second of audio, creating a timeline that suggested the girls had been held captive for at least several days after their abduction. The highway sounds narrowed their search radius significantly, the first concrete lead in decades. When Janet Peterson was brought in to hear the recordings, her hands trembled uncontrollably. The elderly woman, who had never given up hope of finding answers, pressed her fingers to her lips as Emma's voice filled the room. "That's my baby," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's talking about our game. The one they were playing that day in our yard." The emotional weight of the discovery affected everyone differently. For Janet, it was both devastating confirmation and a rekindling of determination. For the investigators, it was the breakthrough they had waited for across generations. As Janet left the station that evening, clutching a photograph of Emma to her chest, Sullivan turned to Santos. "We owe it to her to finish this." he said quietly. No matter what we find. Santos nodded, already mapping potential locations near the highway that matched the audio profile. For the first time in 34 years, the case of the three missing girls had more than just questions. It had direction. The forensics team worked meticulously through the night, analyzing the items recovered from the hidden compartment at Harold Vance's old electronics depot. By morning, the results confirmed what everyone had feared yet hoped for. The DNA on the fragments of clothing, a broken plastic hair clip, and a delicate silver necklace engraved with ELM matched Emma, Lucy, and Mia. These objects, untouched for 3 decades, placed the girls definitively at the location after their disappearance. Detective Santos stood in the lab, examining the necklace under bright lights. This is the first physical evidence connecting the girls to the depot, she explained to Sullivan, who nodded gravely. The retired investigator had spent years chasing phantom leads. Now, tangible proof rested before them. Janet needs to see these, Sullivan said, his voice thick with emotion. She's waited 34 years. At the Peterson home, Janet sat quietly as the detectives laid the items on her kitchen table. Her weathered hands trembled as she reached for the necklace, recognizing it immediately as the friendship pendant she had given Emma on her 7th birthday. The elderly woman's eyes welled with tears, not just of sorrow, but of vindication. I always knew they were somewhere, she whispered. No one believed me when I said they hadn't just wandered off. With renewed purpose, the investigation team returned to search the Peterson yard once more. Under the guidance of forensic archaeologists, they carefully excavated around an old hydrangea bush that had grown wild since 1989. Among its roots, a small metal object caught the afternoon sun. "It's a locket," announced the lead archaeologist, carefully extracting it from the soil. Inside was a faded photograph of the 3 girls, arms linked. Smiling at the camera, the team fell silent, recognizing the significance of the find. Later analysis determined the locket had been deliberately buried, likely by one of the girls before their abduction. Perhaps a secret treasure from their secret agent game, or perhaps, as Sullivan theorized, a final desperate attempt to leave something behind. For Janet, these artifacts became physical anchors to her memories. The locket, especially, offered bittersweet comfort, proof that Emma had been real, that her laughter had once filled the yard, that her absence wasn't just a nightmare from which Janet might someday awaken. "These aren't just evidence," she told the documentary crew, clutching the locket to her chest. "These are pieces of my daughter's life." The task force established a new timeline based on the discoveries. The tapes and personal items formed the foundation of a case that had remained unsolved for over 3 decades. For the first time since 1989, the investigation had momentum, and Janet Peterson had something more powerful than hope. She had proof. DNA analysis of the items found in the depot confirmed what everyone had feared yet hoped for. The girls had been there. Fragments of clothing, a broken hair clip with Emma's hair still attached, and a delicate silver necklace engraved with ELM, Emma, Lucy, Mia, told a story that had remained hidden for 34 years. Janet Peterson held the necklace in trembling hands, recognizing it immediately as the friendship gift she had helped Emma purchase for her 8th birthday, just weeks before the disappearance. "I remember helping her wrap it," she whispered, her voice breaking. She was so excited to give it to her friends. The forensic team, working meticulously, extracted DNA samples that matched the girls' profiles created from their families' submissions. Detective Santos stood silently as the lab technician confirmed what they already knew. "It's them," he said simply, exchanging a weighted glance with Sullivan. With renewed purpose, investigators returned to the Peterson yard, combing through areas previously searched decades ago. Under the ancient oak tree where the children had played their last game of secret agents, a retired officer noticed something unusual: a patch of soil that seemed deliberately disturbed, yet in a childlike pattern. "Children often bury treasures," Sullivan remarked, kneeling despite his arthritic knees. Carefully removing layers of compacted earth, they unearthed a small heart-shaped locket, tarnished by time but unmistakably Emma's. Inside was a tiny photograph of the three girls, smiling in eternal friendship. "She buried it," Janet said, recognition dawning through tears. They were playing spies that day. Hiding secrets was part of their game. The mother clutched this newfound treasure, this final act of her daughter's innocence, as if it were a lifeline to the past. The locket and other recovered items were not just evidence. They were sacred artifacts of lives interrupted. For Janet, they validated decades of unwavering hope and persistence. "I knew," she repeated to anyone who would listen. "I knew we would find something someday." The forensic analysis continued, revealing microscopic traces of a chemical compound on the fabric scraps, consistent with cleaning products used in the electronics industry in the late 1980s. This connection to Harold Vance's business strengthened the case against him posthumously. Sullivan, reviewing the evidence board in the temporary investigation headquarters, pinned a photograph of the locket next to the cassette tapes. "These girls left us breadcrumbs," he observed quietly. "They found ways to leave their mark, even then." For the families, these recovered items represented both heartbreak and validation. Each object told a story of their daughter's final days, stories that had remained untold for too long. As Janet placed Emma's locket around her neck, she made a silent promise to her daughter. The truth would finally come to light, no matter how painful the revelation might be. The task force's investigation took a decisive turn when Detective Santos uncovered old employment records for Harold Vance. The yellowed documents revealed a troubling pattern. Vance had been summarily dismissed from a children's recreation center in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1982. The reason, cryptically noted as inappropriate conduct with minors, had somehow never surfaced during the original investigation. "We never had reason to look at him back then," Sullivan admitted, his weathered face creased with regret. "The depot was 2 miles away. Nobody connected the dots." Further digging revealed something even more disturbing. Vance's name had appeared in police reports concerning the disappearance of a 9-year-old girl in Memphis in 1984. Though questioned, he was never charged. This connection prompted Detective Santos to contact the FBI, bringing federal resources to bear on the decades-old case. "The pattern is unmistakable now," Santos explained during a press briefing. "We're looking at someone who may have been active across multiple states." The investigation soon led to Vance's surviving family members. His distant cousin, who had inherited the property after Harold's death in 2007, sat nervously in the Millbrook police station, avoiding eye contact as she made her confession. "I found those tapes when cleaning out the depot," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I recognized the names from the old news stories. But Harold was family. I just couldn't bring myself to tarnish the family name." The revelation that someone had known about the tapes for years, had held physical evidence of the girl's fate, while Janet Peterson continued her tireless vigil, sent shockwaves through Millbrook. Outside the police station, community members gathered with candles, their faces hardened with a mixture of grief and betrayal. "How could anyone choose family reputation over those little girls?" demanded a longtime resident, tears streaming down her face. "Over Janet's suffering?" The town, already fractured by decades of suspicion, found itself further divided. Some residents defended the cousin's silence as misguided loyalty, while others called for criminal charges. Local church groups organized prayer circles, but even these were tinged with tension as neighbors questioned neighbors about what else might have been hidden all these years. Janet, ever dignified despite her pain, issued a simple statement through her attorney. "The truth matters more than blame. I just want to know what happened to my Emma and her friends." As investigators continued processing evidence from the depot, the community of Millbrook faced its most difficult reckoning yet. The possibility that the monster they had imagined lurking in shadows had instead been walking among them all along. The community center of Millbrook buzzed with hushed conversations as people filed in for the memorial service. 34 years of grief hung in the air like a physical presence. Janet Peterson stood near the entrance, her weathered hands clutching a framed photograph of Emma. Though time had etched lines across her face, the determination in her eyes remained unchanged. The families of Lucy and Mia sat in the front row, their shoulders touching in silent solidarity. Detective Santos observed from the back, noting how the entire town seemed to breathe as one organism, wounded but surviving. National news vans lined the parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like metal flowers. "We gather today not just to remember, but to heal," began the pastor, his voice carrying across the packed room. Candles flickered on a memorial table adorned with childhood photographs, stuffed animals, and small tokens representing the girls' interrupted lives. As community members shared memories, the atmosphere shifted between tears and tentative laughter. A childhood friend recalled how Emma had insisted on wearing her superhero cape to school. Another remembered Lucy's infectious giggle during playground games. These fragments of joy seemed to briefly resurrect the children in the collective memory of Millbrook. Halfway through the service, an elderly man rose shakily from his seat. Walter Jenkins, a former neighbor who had lived 3 houses down from the Peterson home, approached the microphone with trembling steps. "I can't carry this anymore," he began, voice breaking. "That day, July 15th, I was trimming my hedges when I saw them." The room fell completely silent. The girls were following a man toward a vehicle parked down the street. They seemed to know him. I thought nothing of it until the search began. Janet's sharp intake of breath cut through the silence. "I was afraid," Jenkins continued, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Afraid you'd all blame me for not stopping it. Afraid because I recognized the man, but couldn't believe someone from our community could do such a thing." Sullivan immediately approached Jenkins while Santos made a call outside. Within hours, a forensic team was dispatched to the grounds surrounding the depot. The confession had provided a crucial missing piece, confirmation that the girls had been taken by someone they recognized, someone they trusted enough to follow willingly. As the memorial concluded, Janet found herself surrounded by neighbors offering support. For the first time in decades, the weight of isolation lifted slightly from her shoulders. The community, fractured for so long by suspicion and unspoken accusations, began to knit itself back together through shared purpose. That night, floodlights illuminated the depot grounds as investigators began their search for evidence that had remained hidden for 34 years beneath layers of soil and silence. The floorboards creaked ominously as Detective Santos stepped carefully across the depot's worn surface. Something about the hollow sound had caught her attention, an inconsistency in the building's structure that her experienced eye couldn't ignore. When the forensic team removed the loose planks, they revealed what everyone had hoped for yet dreaded finding: a hidden room beneath the depot. "We need more light down here," Santos called, her voice echoing in the cramped space. The beam of her flashlight illuminated what appeared to be a child's shoe, covered in decades of dust. The air was thick with the musty scent of abandonment and something else, a lingering chemical odor that matched what the retired neighbor had described from 34 years ago. Retired investigator Sullivan descended the makeshift stairs, his weathered face grim. "Harold Vance was more methodical than we gave him credit for," he muttered, surveying the hidden chamber. The walls were lined with soundproofing material, explaining why no one had heard the children's cries despite the depot's proximity to the highway. Among the scattered debris, technicians uncovered small treasures that broke everyone's hearts: a faded hair ribbon that matched the description of one Lucy had worn, a child's drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands, and most significantly, a discarded camera with undeveloped films still inside. "This changes everything," Santos whispered, carefully bagging the evidence. The camera was sent to a specialized forensic photography lab, where technicians painstakingly developed the degraded film. When the images finally emerged, the entire investigation team fell silent. Though blurry and discolored, the photographs showed Emma, Lucy, and Mia huddled together in what appeared to be this very room, their faces fearful but unmistakably alive. Days after their reported disappearance, Janet Peterson's hands trembled as she viewed the photographs. "They were alive," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "All that time we were searching the woods, they were here." The discovery prompted a disturbing new line of inquiry. The sophisticated nature of the hidden room, the careful soundproofing, and the logistics of maintaining 3 captive children suggested Vance hadn't acted alone. Someone else in Millbrook must have helped him, someone who had remained invisible to investigators for over 3 decades. The depot was active back then, Sullivan noted, reviewing old business records. Vance couldn't have managed the business and monitored the girls simultaneously. He needed an accomplice. As the team expanded their investigation, a pattern emerged pointing to another community member. Someone respected, someone no one had ever suspected. The revelation sent shockwaves through Millbrook, as residents confronted the possibility that the monster hadn't been just Harold Vance, but potentially someone they still greeted on the street every day. Detective Elena Santos stared at the evidence board, her analytical mind processing each fragment of the case. Across the room, retired investigator Thomas Sullivan leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, seemingly lost in thought. Their approaches couldn't be more different. "We need to run another sweep of the depot grounds with ground-penetrating radar," Elena insisted, tapping her tablet. "The soil composition suggests—" "Those machines won't tell you what the town already knows," Thomas interrupted, his weathered face creasing with frustration. "I've known these streets for 40 years. People talk to me differently than they'll talk to your fancy equipment." The tension between them had been building for days. Elena relied on forensic science and methodical procedure, while Thomas trusted his gut and decades of local connections. Their disagreements had become legendary among the task force members, who often exchanged knowing glances when the two began another debate. Yet despite their differences, their partnership was yielding results. That morning, Thomas had convinced a former depot employee to reveal information about a crawl space beneath the main floor, something that wasn't on any building plans. Elena's team had immediately deployed their equipment, confirming the anomaly. "I still don't understand why you won't let me interview the Hendersons again," Thomas said, referring to a family who had lived near the depot in '89. Elena sighed. "Because their statements have been consistent for 35 years, and we need to focus on physical evidence that won't deteriorate further." Outside the investigation room, reporters gathered daily, their cameras trained on the depot entrance. The pressure was mounting. Families of Lucy and Mia called hourly, desperate for updates, while the FBI pressed for faster results. Through it all, Janet Peterson had become the unexpected mediator. Now, in her 70s, she moved between the grieving families and the investigation team with quiet dignity. When tensions flared between Elena and Thomas, it was often Janet who brought perspective. "They were just little girls playing secret agents," she had reminded them yesterday, her voice soft but firm. "Don't forget that while you're arguing about methodology." Her words had silenced the room. Even Elena, typically unmoved by emotional appeals, had nodded respectfully. That afternoon, when Thomas suggested interviewing a retired church caretaker who might recognize the bell sound from the tapes, Elena surprised everyone by agreeing immediately. The detective was learning that Sullivan's knowledge of Millbrook's hidden connections sometimes provided shortcuts her scientific approach couldn't match. As the investigation intensified, their unlikely alliance strengthened. Elena's meticulous evidence collection complemented Thomas's intuitive understanding of local dynamics. The task force began to see how these opposing approaches, when working in tandem rather than opposition, might finally bring answers to a case that had haunted Millbrook for 35 years. Janet watched their growing cooperation with quiet hope, her resolve deepening with each passing day. Detective Camila Santos hunched over the audio tapes for the 20th time, her eyes burning from exhaustion. The voices of Emma, Lucy, and Mia played through her headphones. Innocent children playing secret agents while something sinister lurked beyond their awareness. She was about to remove her headphones when a sound in the background caught her attention. "Sullivan, listen to this," she called to her partner. James Sullivan, his weathered face showing every year of his decades in law enforcement, leaned in as she replayed the segment. "That's St. Andrew's bell," he whispered, recognition dawning in his eyes. "It only rings that pattern for Sunday service." The distinctive three-toll sequence of the church bell became their unexpected breakthrough. By calculating the sound's distance and clarity on the recording, the team could triangulate the exact location where the girls had been held, an abandoned outbuilding less than half a mile from Vance's electronics depot. "The acoustics match perfectly," Santos explained to Janet Peterson the following morning. The elderly woman's hands trembled as she clutched her coffee mug. "We believe they were kept there for at least several days after their disappearance." Within hours, forensic teams descended on the dilapidated structure. The building, partially reclaimed by nature after 34 years of abandonment, yielded its secrets reluctantly. Beneath rotting floorboards, technicians discovered a child's hair ribbon that DNA testing would later confirm belonged to Lucy. A partial fingerprint matched samples from Vance's personal effects, creating an irrefutable connection. "We found rope fibers consistent with restraints," Santos told Sullivan as they surveyed the scene, "and traces of the same chemical compound neighbors reported smelling that summer." The retired investigator nodded grimly. "I interviewed 3 people about that smell back then. We thought it was just the new fertilizer the county was using on roadside plantings." As evidence mounted, media vans clogged Millbrook's narrow streets. National news anchors stood before the outbuilding, recounting the tragedy in somber tones while curious onlookers gathered behind police tape. The peaceful anonymity the families had gradually rebuilt over 3 decades evaporated overnight. Janet found reporters camped on her front lawn each morning. Lucy's parents, who had divorced under the strain of their loss, were forced to navigate their shared grief under the glare of cameras. Mia's older brother, now a father himself, broke down during an ambush interview outside his workplace. "This town has carried this wound for 34 years, Sullivan told Santos as they watched the circus unfold. "Now they're picking at the scab for ratings." "But we're close," Santos replied, her determination unwavering. The church bell was the key. Everything else is falling into place. What neither detective could have anticipated was how quickly their investigation would lead them to Vance's accomplice, someone whose name had been hiding in plain sight all along. As the investigation intensified, Detective Santos discovered a crucial clue hidden within the audio tapes: the distinctive sound of a church bell tolling in the background, a sound that rang every hour on the hour, pinpointed the exact location where Emma, Lucy, and Mia had been held captive. This sonic fingerprint led the police directly to an abandoned outbuilding less than half a mile from the depot. "That bell belonged to St. Matthew's," Sullivan explained, his weathered face creasing with recognition. "It hasn't rung since 1997, when the steeple was damaged in a storm." The forensic team descended upon the dilapidated structure, meticulously combing through decades of dust and decay. Their efforts yielded a treasure trove of evidence: hair fibers, partial fingerprints, and faded markings on the walls that matched the heights of 3 small children. All of it tied Harold Vance definitively to the crime. But the most disturbing discovery came when Detective Santos reviewed purchasing records from the hardware store, where Vance had been a regular customer. The records showed he had bought unusual quantities of padlocks, soundproofing materials, and specialized tools, all within days of the girl's disappearance. More tellingly, he hadn't made these purchases alone. Someone helped him, Janet whispered, her voice barely audible as she sat in Santos's office, clutching Emma's locket. Someone from our town. The media frenzy escalated to unprecedented levels. National news vans lined Millbrook's quiet streets, and reporters ambushed longtime residents for comments. The families struggled with this renewed attention, their private grief once again becoming public spectacle. Lucy's parents refused to leave their home, while Mia's mother granted a single tearful interview before retreating from the spotlight. Through methodical investigation, Santos and Sullivan identified a pattern of overlooked warning signs. Former employees at the depot recalled Vance's unexplained absences, his insistence on working alone in certain areas, and his unusual interest in local children's activities. Several townspeople remembered seeing him with another man, always in hushed conversation, always stopping when others approached. "We should have known," a former depot employee told investigators. "The signs were there, but nobody wanted to see them." The breakthrough came when Sullivan recognized a voice in the background of one tape, belonging to Edward Winters, a respected business owner whose family had lived in Millbrook for generations. When confronted with the evidence, Winters crumbled under questioning. "I never knew what he was going to do to them," Winters sobbed in the interrogation room. "He had something on me. I just helped him move them. I was scared of him." The confession sent shockwaves through the community. For Janet Peterson, it brought answers but no peace. The truth had finally emerged, but at a devastating cost to the town she still called home. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The revelation of Harold Vance's accomplice sent shockwaves through Millbrook's tight-knit community. After weeks of intensive investigation, Detective Santos and Sullivan identified William Brenner, a former church deacon and respected business owner, as Vance's partner in the decades-old crime. The man who had once organized search parties for the missing girls had harbored their terrible secret all along. "I never wanted to hurt them," Brenner whispered during his videotape confession, his weathered hands trembling. "Harold said we were just going to scare them. They'd seen something they shouldn't have at the depot." The aging man broke down as he described how fear and misplaced loyalty had kept him silent for 35 years. Forensic evidence from the hidden room beneath the electronics depot corroborated his testimony. Fingerprints matched samples taken from Brenner's home, and fibers from his vehicle were found on items belonging to the girls. The church bell heard on the cassette tapes, the sound that had ultimately cracked the case, came from St. Mary's, where Brenner had served as deacon for over 4 decades. Janet Peterson sat stone-faced in the courtroom as Brenner was formally charged. The woman who had never given up hope now faced the man who had helped destroy her family. Their eyes met briefly across the room, hers steady with quiet dignity, his downcast with shame. "We trusted him," said a former neighbor outside the courthouse. "William helped search for those girls. He brought food to the Peterson home, all while knowing." Her voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of overlooked warning signs. Brenner had often volunteered for youth programs, positioning himself as a pillar of the community while helping Vance conceal evidence. Former depot employees recalled seeing the two men in heated discussions that abruptly ended when others approached. Sullivan, who had known Brenner for decades, struggled with the betrayal. "Sometimes the monsters don't look like monsters," the retired investigator told reporters. "They look like your neighbors, your friends." That's what makes this case so devastating. For the families of Emma, Lucy, and Mia, the confession brought answers but no peace. The girls' final moments remained shrouded in ambiguity, with Brenner claiming ignorance about certain details and blaming the now-deceased Vance for the worst atrocities. As Brenner was led away in handcuffs, The community gathered outside the courthouse, not in celebration, but in solemn acknowledgement. Justice had arrived, but at a terrible cost. The truth had been living among them all along, hidden behind friendly smiles and community service. Millbrook would never be the same. Justice arrived for Emma, Lucy, and Mia with the closing of their case, a bittersweet victory 35 years in the making. The confession from Harold Vance's accomplice, a man who had walked Millbrook streets as a respected citizen for decades, sent ripples through the community that would never fully subside. His testimony provided the final pieces of a puzzle that had tormented 3 families and an entire town for a generation. Janet Peterson stood on the courthouse steps, her silver hair catching the late afternoon sunlight. The years had etched deep lines around her eyes, but they still held the same fierce determination that had sustained her through decades of uncertainty. "Today, my daughter can rest," she told the gathered reporters, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. The families gathered privately that evening, sharing memories of 3 little girls whose laughter had been silenced too soon. Lucy's mother clutched a faded photograph, while Mia's father sat in reverent silence. The answers they'd received could never fill the void left by their daughters, but the truth had lifted a weight they'd carried for too long. Detective Santos watched from a respectful distance. The investigation had consumed her for months, but she knew her connection to the case was temporary compared to the lifetime of grief these families had endured. Her partnership with Sullivan, though initially strained, had proven invaluable, his knowledge of local dynamics complementing her forensic expertise. "Some cases change you," the retired investigator remarked, his weathered hands fidgeting with his coffee cup. "This one changed all of us." In the weeks that followed, the Emma, Lucy, and Mia Foundation took shape, spearheaded by Janet and supported by donations from across the country. Its mission, to provide resources for families of missing children and fund advanced search technologies, transformed decades of pain into purpose. The Foundation's first act was establishing a scholarship for young women pursuing careers in forensic science or victim advocacy. "Our girls never got to grow up and change the world," Janet explained at the launch ceremony. "But through this work, they still can." Millbrook itself began a slow process of healing. The depot was demolished, with plans to create a memorial garden in its place. Community members who had drifted apart in suspicion and grief found their way back to each other, united by shared trauma and the relief of resolution. For Janet, celebration felt impossible, but peace had finally become attainable. In her living room, surrounded by photographs of Emma at various ages, the real ones from childhood and the age-progressed images she'd commissioned over the years, she allowed herself to exhale fully for the first time since that July afternoon in 1989. "I kept my promise," she whispered to her daughter's smiling face. "I never stopped looking for you."